Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, August 10th of 2021. We're two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gathered for about 50 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is August 15th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our good friend Charles Willer in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year B, and that puts us in the Gospel of John. And we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's how it works. We develop perspectives independently after the leadoff person shares some formative questions, and then in the virtual discussion room we share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Sarah Mickelson, Tampa.
Bill Hall in St. Petersburg, Florida.
You're on mute, Charles. That's Charles Willard in Minnesota. And I'm Don Upton, and I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina today. And our leadoff person is Sarah Mickelson. Hello, my friend, and thank you for leading today's discussion.
Reconnected.
Thanks, Charles.
Welcome, everybody. We're in John chapter 6. We're looking at verses 51 through 58. This is our fourth week in conversation about chapter 6. So with that thought in mind, I think that we are now at what I would call the culmination of chapter 6. So I'm going to start reading at verse 51. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Then the Jews disputed among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my body is true drink. And those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. And just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and then they died, but the one who eats this bread will live forever. And that's the ending of our reading. Wow. So we have moved through, in chapter 6, what we call the bread discourse. And we've moved through the idea of meeting the physical needs of hunger, which came to us in the story of the loaves and fishes. And we've worked through the idea of living bread that nourishes the soul. And that was last week's text. And now I've arrived at this, what we would call the communion or the Eucharist moment in the book of John. If you think about moving through those particular events and the dialogue or the narrative that were given from the book of John in chapter 6, what essential truths might we observe or take from this sequence of thought? Bill, you volunteered to help us. You want to kick the can and see what goes?
Yeah, out of rash boldness, I volunteered to go first. In our pre-recording conversation, it was noted that the importance of your use of the word sequence. When I think about it, that is a key word from the very first word of John. We've noted previously, and probably all of our listeners are familiar with the so-called synoptics, the three Gospels that to some extent tell the story similarly. And John is, in a sense, a standalone gospel. Not truly, but the style is certainly different. And I've read various attempts to characterize the style of John, all of which I think are telling the truth, none of which fully encapsulate it. The very first words of John signal to us that he's telling the story differently. Likely the author was the disciple John. And I remember in seminary an entire lecture on the word by a very skilled professor who went in depth of what that meant in the Greek culture and the Hebrew culture. And I remember at the end of his lecture, I'm paraphrasing, of course, characterizing. In effect, he said, I've told you as much as I know, and we still don't fully know what that meant. But it's a signal, I would say, John is saying, folks, you know the details. I don't need to retell the birth story. And I'm going to sequence things differently, Sarah. Sequence, for example, early in the narrative is the cleansing of the temple in John. In the synoptics, it's later in the gospel. I don't think that's a matter of who's chronologically right. It's that John is offering that story in a different context. I remember as a child when there wasn't TV and when we would visit family, they would tell a lot of stories. And one night, two aunts got in an argument over the exact date that something occurred. And one of the men finally chuckled and said, you both agree that that event occurred, right? Yes. Then why don't we stop arguing about the date and talk about the meaning of the event, because it had some meaning. So I think that John signals us early on that he's going to sequence things differently and invite us into a deeper understanding. Now, next week, we will follow up on this story where the disciples said, this teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? And Jesus says, does this offend you? That's, again, a signal to us that this chapter is very, very challenging to us. So your question of sequence, what I would say is that, again, it's a signal to me and to us that we're not going to easily plow this ground. And I suspect at the end of this podcast, my professor's words will echo. We've only just begun to understand this. So that's, and I'll save my comments about the Lord's Supper to your other questions. They fit better there. Another analogy is I'm soon to celebrate a decade birthday, and I'm living in a retirement center. And one of the things that with some frequency comes up in our conversations here is we look back on our life and we now understand things we didn't understand at the time. Okay? And for me, the fact that this was likely written somewhere toward the end of the first century, I see John a bit older and wiser and looking back at what he experienced and others and inviting not a contradictory, I'd like to think a complementary understanding of that. And I'll stop with that, Sarah. Thank you for the question.
Charles, do you want to throw anything in here?
No, thank you.
Don, you like the word sequence. Tell me where that takes you.
Well, I needed something to work with, so I appreciate the word because this is so challenging. And so I liked it. It's an interesting idea because it also includes kind of an idea of there's a journey. It's a literary journey in this chapter, step to step to step to step, a theme that's running through it. So I like that of the sequence. I wonder if there's some application to our lives and that journey, that sequencing. And I thought, well, what are some of the pieces out of here that matter in the sequence? So I went ahead and just kind of took out a little scalpel and went, okay, let's take this and this and this. And even as I did it, I was confronted with the contradictions and the power and the shock of where this leads up to. And I'm stealing the word shock from a commentator that I'll quote in just a minute. That I think we're supposed to be shocked. That's my new takeaway in my life with this. It's supposed to be. And I think as a younger man or as a child, I felt like the journey was to be comfortable with it. Okay, don't worry about it. Like, no, this is supposed to be a shock. Yikes. It's meant to be a wake-up call. And so some of those things I thought popped out for me would be, the nuggets would be early on in the chapter, in the sequencing. Where are we to buy bread? And the echo through it is nowhere. Not enough. There's nowhere to buy bread. There's so much to be bought, it cannot be done. I always let the question just dangle like, well, it must be somewhere. We'll figure it out. No, there's nowhere to buy bread. It's impossible. Or Philip makes it more clear. He says, there's not enough money to get the job done. So there's nowhere, and there's not enough resources to get the job done. It's impossible. It's unimaginable. And Philip, such a practical guy, I guess, he demonstrates that. There is nowhere, there's not enough money. Just practically, it's unimaginable. It's technically impossible to do. We can't bake or buy our way out of this. But here's Jesus. We can't bake or buy our way into nourishment, and we can't bake or buy our way into Jesus, the whole Jesus. And I'm seeing wholeness this reading more than I have. I usually see pieces, the classic things in a communion, a piece of God. I'm seeing the whole Jesus. Jesus is there being sought out every step of the way. He's present to break the bread and distribute the fish, all of him. He's not the dash of salt. He's not the piece of yeast. It's all of him, my body and my blood. Not some of my body, not some of my blood, but all of him. Bill Wallach, who used to teach our lectionary class at Palmacia Presbyterian Church, where the four of us had a chance to meet and get to know each other, used to say, it's necessary to consume the whole Christ. That's written large in the margins of my Bible. And I'd say the whole table, too. My mind is on the table all the time, confess. My mind's on nourishment all the time. It's a thing for me. I like to dine. I like to plan for dining. I like to cook. I like to eat. But not that table. My mind is on dining and nourishment all the time, but not that nourishment. Not I'm still trying to bake my way out, and that's really a distraction. What I'm trying to get to is the shock of this big takeaway, because the sequence doesn't lead up to a resolution. Well, it does. What is the body of Christ? But I think in a literary way, it's meant to have a shock that was unexpected for me this time. I'm trying to settle the shock. Audrey West summed it up for me pretty well. She wrote in the Christian Century in August of 2012 about the passage, and she focused on shock. And she said, why would Jesus teach such a shocking metaphor? Perhaps the shock is necessary to drag our appetites and attention away from the cultural drive to conquer and consume, whether the object of the consumption is the earth or one another. So thank you for that question, sir.
Wow. So it was a big idea for me to come up with the recognition that in the chapter 6 of John, the author moves us deliberately through some navigatable steps. And it reminded me about education and how teachers will sequence ideas of thought or moments of discovery for students to help navigate or help them build knowledge from these discoveries. And good teachers do that with a wonderful, very deft way of doing it. Some very, I would call it almost orchestrating it beautifully to help a student stop at this station, imagine, see, observe, formulate, and then move to the second station and make new discoveries that are built foundationally upon the discoveries made at table 1 or at station 1. And I like the idea that, and bear with me while I kind of try to navigate this idea, that you'll walk from station 1 to station 2 to station 3, making discoveries along the way, and then you'll start again at station 1 and go, I didn't see that the first time. I didn't imagine that the first time. Or, oh, wow, so what I gained from table 3 moves me back to table 1, and I make new discoveries there. And I think that's how the book, this particular chapter of this book works for me, is that I read it and I never observed the sequence before this week. And I thought that was really lovely to arrive at that and feel what I would call the craft of a really good teacher working as the backbone or the skeletal scaffolding of this passage for me. And I thought about the deliberation and the sequencing effort that maybe the narrator chose, and although it's very different than other Gospels, that maybe the narrator of this particular passage, the writing of this particular passage, was done with such deliberation that we would arrive at the essential truth. And I think the essential truth is that if you imagine metaphorically Christ to be the source of all goodness and all understanding, which kind of builds on the idea that the earth is the Lord's from Psalms, and everything within it is as well, then everything we do, everything we take into our bodies becomes an element that God can use for the goodness to take hold and make root in our family and our lives. So it changes the way I look at every meal I prepare. It changes the way I think about food that I eat. It changes the way I think about who I eat with and the dialogue we're having. And that if everything is sacred, where does the profane start? And maybe the profane starts when we don't realize that everything is sacred. So for me, that's where I landed after question 1, is that sequence of thought brought me to that essential truth. Everything is sacred. And the sooner I see that, the more vivid my experience is going to be. Which leads me to question 2. In John's Gospel, John introduces his version of the communion words of institution in this particular passage. And these words are not given at the Last Supper event like they are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, with an event to do this in remembrance of me, but through the bread metaphor, which amplifies the emergence of abundant life in Christ and in an active present tense, which that's kind of a trick there. And that led me to a new thought. What do you make of that or this, and what new understanding might this offer us as we partake in communion regularly? And I'm using the present tense as the fulcrum point here. What do you make of that, and what new understanding might this offer us as we partake in communion regularly? Don, I'm going to start with you on this one since Bill was kind enough to volunteer last time.
Part of it might be how to read John. How does the present tense allow us to read John? Because let me tell you, this book I used to hold close when I was young. This is hard, and so I need a toolkit. And I think what you're laying out, reading it with the present tense in mind, is very helpful. Even though it's opens with the words in the beginning with the word, that helps me. So one way I'm dealing with it is the present tense is John is about survival, is a theme of survival. Don't drown. Don't get arrested and killed. Don't starve to death. And so that's, the sequencing that runs all the way through the book. So we've got this sense of survival. Don't starve, especially. Can you get some food for me, please? So that there's a present tense of that, and then you combine it with things being set before people. What is set before me? Especially nourishment. What is this? And in the present tense, I'll act it out. I think it works in the 20th century, 21st century, just like it did then. People set things before me all the time. And if you found yourself in that situation, you say, especially as a child, what is this? What's in this plate? What's on these ingredients? What is this you're about to feed me? Tell me, please. You've been there. What is this? And even if you're exploring all kinds of new cuisine, you're going to say, would you please tell me about this? What is this? You probably have followed, you're into food. You know that James Corden, the late night talk show host, is in a lot of hot water because he has a funny game that he plays where if you don't get the answer right, I forgot how the game works, but you have to eat something. And it's described in detail, usually for someone from the West or an American or somebody that gets choice and wealth. It's something that's disgusting to them, and he's a lot of hot water because what they're putting in front of people are things that are viewed as not just wholesome and nourishing, but delicacies in parts of the world. So here we are going, what is this you're putting in front of me? And I think that question, what is this, because it's so shocking, is Jesus helping us understand who he is. John, of course, starts with Nicole Parton-Adler, who preaches at church that we attend years ago, said, this is a book that starts with the answer to the question. But here we are all through John going, what is this? And Jesus puts the shock into it. What are you feeding me? What is this that is nourishing me? And then the final note I gather of this is a sense of forgetfulness that I think runs the 21st century. That even though this is not at the table, this is not the Last Supper, this is the real time, I'm waiting for the supper to be set for me. I put communion, the body and the blood, whether you're going to look at remembrance in other Gospels or what this is supposed to be, in other people's hands. I have communion when I'm told to have communion. How about you? I forget about communion because it's not on the plan for this week. I happen to be a part of a denomination and a church that stages that through the year with all great intent. And how often do you walk in going, oh, it's communion today? I depend on other people to set something in front of me, and I offload that. And I'm questioning that today. The present is really depending on other people to set something for me and not myself. So I'm not dwelling on this at all. I'm not meditating on this at all. Thanks to John, I'm realizing I'm waiting for other people to tee this up for me and say, oh, it's time for communion. Let us break bread together. That's what I got, Sarah.
So I thought about the word communion, and not as the physical elements of bread and wine, but I thought about the word communion from a bigger sense of idea, that we're going to hold together a spiritual agreement, that we're going to commune, we're going to focus and put our attention on becoming one with our Christ, with God, and that God, with intention, took the step that we call sacrifice and crucifixion, and transformed them into something we could tangibly see, tangibly touch, and experience, so that we might know inside and out how loved we are. And that for me was, okay, so let's step back to that mysticism right there. And that we are standing with a deliberate table setter, Don, to use your words, that God has set this table with intention so that we might have a better understanding and a continual understanding of moving us toward being in communion with our Creator. So for me, this may be a Presbyterian idea, the deliberate the actions that Christ takes that moves toward us so that we might see and understand how much we're loved. And for me, as I move to this idea of taking communion regularly, and it may be once a quarter, it might be once every week, it doesn't really, I don't know if it matters to me or not. I haven't given that a lot of thought, but I have thought about the meaningful nature of this particular exercise or this particular thing that we do, that we pause and we consider in what it means to unlocking abundant life for ourselves and for each other. And I think that's kind of an interesting thought when you think about it as something that happens continually, that you're going to mature, that you're going to evolve, that you're going to start to see things with new eyes because of the intentionality of this, that you're going to revisit it I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to revisit it, and I'm going to think about it some more, and something really magical happens because you see things in a new way. And I have to say that I think that's the best part about thinking of this in present tense, is it's continual, that it is going to be something I can rely upon like a safety line on a sailboat. It goes continually around the boat so that I can stay attached, involved, engaged, and see new things each time I take a step. And when I do that with commitment, and I do that with consistency, that helps me. And I think that those are all part of the present tense event in this particular passage. Bill, what do you think?
Thank you. I'll share with you what this question and the focus on the present tense led me to. It's interesting, and I hadn't thought about this till this study, that when we have communion, the minister doesn't use the words of the gospel, but rather the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 11. That's not a problem. It's just interesting that we go there. And I think the words of institution are a time-tested, brief reminder of the meaning of communion. So I think it's appropriate. Also, your question, and I'll get back to the present tense, led me to remember that in John, the upper room experience goes from chapter 13 through chapter 17. And let me just briefly remind us of some of what happens in that telling of the first communion, if you please. He washed the disciples' feet. He predicts a betrayal. He says that what's most important is that you love one another. Everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. He predicts Peter's denial. He promises the Holy Spirit. He's the true vine. The world will hate us. He speaks again of the Holy Spirit, that the sorrow will turn to joy, and then a whole chapter in prayer for the disciples. So for me, Sarah, and I think I may be echoing what you said, the present tense means that this very moment, as we are recording this podcast, Christ is the living bread for us, not just when we go to the table and have communion. Now, when I remember that, it is helpful to me that in this moment, no matter what's happening with me in my life, in the world, that there is an abundance in the here and now. It is truly present tense. And for me, that doesn't take away from the mystery of actually sitting at the table. But, and I'm at the risk of sounding maybe judgmental, I've talked to people at times who almost look upon receiving Mass or communion as a magical moment, and that if they aren't there, they can't have that depth of feeling. Not for me to judge, but what has been helpful to me is, again, in the ordinariness of life. At one time, I don't think they still do it, in some traditions, there was a long season called Ordinary Time in the lectionary. And I like that. As an old country boy, I like the word ordinary. God loves ordinary and sometimes ornery people. And that sense that this moment is filled with the presence of God. I'm a big fan of Richard Rohr. Read him each day. And for me, a part of what Rohr does for me is to remind me that in this moment, the fullness of God is present. And yet again, Sarah, I'll hand the ball off, thinking I've only just begun to understand your question.
Thank you. Charles, do you want to throw anything in?
I've been thinking during the last few minutes of our conversation, maybe a little bit more than that, about where we are right now. And I realized that for me, the opportunity to participate in communion has not been present for almost a year and a half. And I don't believe that the work of the church is stopped because that happened. I'm looking for, because there are other ways in which the church is present in my life, but I recognize that for me at least, the opportunity to participate in the way the church has managed communion for centuries now has simply not been a present option. And I'm not clear that that's likely to change in the near future. And I don't think that makes a difference in the relationship I have to God or Jesus. But I'm not clear what I'm missing by not being able to participate in that particular way. And I'll leave it at that. It's a puzzle.
Thank you, Charles. I think that's a truth that a lot of people are thinking about right now.
Well, but see, I don't think, I'm not sure that Presbyterians who are also like I am miss that. It was only in the focus on this passage that brings that to mind, and I don't think that this passage and the commands that are set upon this passage, I don't think, for example, that people think about consuming the literal body and blood of Jesus when they're taking communion. Maybe my Roman Catholic friends do, but I don't. It's something else.
I'm kind of with you on that. I think about the iterations of bread that occur around the country and around the world. And bread can be saltines, bread can be matzah, bread can be sourdough, bread can be pumpernickel, bread can be pita bread. It can be, any variety. It can almost be a pretzel. And that the ingredients that go into everything that is bread are basically the same: flour, water, salt, yeast. And the varying amounts of each of those determine what the bread looks like on the backside or on the finished side. And any of that can be used as an element of communion. Now, if we were to look at the wine start or the grape juice side of the equation, whatever we're drinking, the elements are going to be similar. They're going to be basically H2O and then some biology that goes with a grape. And all of that are very essential, very simple, very accessible from a perspective of just chemically looking at what it is. And all of those things are so ordinary Bill, using your word, that it's a mystery to me, and I'm grateful for it, that these things can be knit together to mean something and can be a source of reflection and rumination or mulling, Bill, to evolve my relationship with my Creator. And I think that's the beauty of the mystery here. I agree with you, Charles. I ponder whether or not how much we value or how much we root into the idea that communion's an essential versus something that can happen periodically versus something that, because of COVID, hasn't happened in 18 months for some of us. I think about that. Question number 3, John's 6th chapter is riddled with words and metaphors about eating, chewing, choking on, getting food stuck in your teeth, digesting, nourishing, and sustenance. The English translations don't necessarily give us the nuances that we get from the original language. So I threw all that in so that we would have at least a foundational understanding that these words and these meanings are in this text in the book of John in chapter 6. As Christ followers, we know that the path can be hard and unforgiving one moment and unfolding into an ease and an unexpected epiphany in the next. Gifts. We're asked to experience Holy Communion, physically and spiritually eating bread and drinking the cup, as both a continual noun and a verb. I'm using my parts of speech today. I'm sorry. How has your understanding of communion changed, moved, and evolved since the first time you participated in this particular sacrament? I'm going to throw out I've shared this story before with the 4 of you or 3 of you, and when I was younger, I mean, I was like 11, maybe 12, maybe a little bit younger than that. Might have been 8 or 9. And we had communion. I used to watch how other people did it to determine how I should do it, which is typical of kids in church. And when they passed the plate to me, I wasn't sure how much bread to take. Do you take a little? Do you take a lot? Is it based upon how the bread pulls? So I would watch how much other people took, and it led me down an idea that maybe you took as much as you needed for forgiveness for the amount of sin that you'd committed since you last had communion, which is a big idea for a 9-year-old. You're like looking at this going, well, maybe it's about how much forgiveness you need. And so then you take a bigger piece of bread if you feel like you've had a really interesting time since last communion. And it didn't click in my brain until much later, probably in my 20s, that had nothing to do with how much bread you took. It had more to do with the fact that communion was usually happening between 12 and people were hungry. And that led me to a new understanding of communion. How hungry are we for this particular gift of sacrament? How hungry are we when it's our turn to pull a piece of bread and drink the cup? And are we hungry for this particular food? Are we hungry for this particular meal? And so, Charles, I think your question about how frequent or infrequent we've had communion may play into this particular answer. But for me, the act of communion has changed because whose hands offered it to me first? It was usually my parents on either side. And that's another part of the story, too. It's whose hands offered the communion first. And then who are you offering communion to now? So all of these pieces kind of play into this story or this fabric that we're looking at. And we understand more about communion now, Bill, in the wealth of our ears than we might have in our younger days when we first were offered the opportunity to participate in the sacrament. What do you think?
You're handing it to me, Sarah.
Sure.
I didn't know who the you was. Again, I'm somewhat going to echo you. This question reminded me that I was born into a third or fourth generation Presbyterian family. That's the tradition I grew up with. And I could not take communion until I was confirmed, which in my case was at age 13 when I made my public profession of faith. And I remember that my first communion was very significant. Now, somehow the way my clerk of session, Sunday school superintendent father explained it to me, I didn't particularly feel excluded when I didn't take it. It was that the meaning of this and the importance of making my own choice about being a follower of Jesus Christ. And your verbs here, how has my understanding changed, moved, and evolved? I like those verbs. When I got into college, during my freshman year, began to act on the nudging to become a minister, convinced that there's no way that this old country boy was suited for that. And when I went off to senior college in Memphis, Tennessee, I wisely chose to attend a unbelievable range of worship services. I mean, from Pentecostal to high church this and black churches and white churches, and I'm grateful that I did that. And I knew early on that the form of government was important to me. What I didn't understand early in that journey was how important the Lord's Supper was. And very briefly, I had the experience of going in a tradition for worship where it was said clearly, if you're not a member of this denomination, you are not to take communion. I went to others where it was wide open. And it became clear to me that I could not serve in the tradition that the old term was fence the table. Now, the fencing was a somewhat different idea. That was, you had to be examined by the pastor and deemed worthy, and you got a token and you could receive communion. But I'm using that as a metaphor of I knew I could not stand at the Lord's table and say in any sense, we'll decide who may or may not receive this communion. Jesus offered it to Judas, who betrayed him, to Peter, who denied him. So it's not about we are worthy because of God's love. We're not worthy based on our abilities. Now, again, evolved, moved. For about a dozen years, I used to lead every summer for the Presbytery a backpacking trip on the Appalachian Trail with whitewater rafting on the Chattooga River. And I tried not to be preachy and let the nature experience speak to the students. And one year, we would always gather around the campfire at night, doing the fire safely, and reflect. And one of the students said, we haven't had communion. This was the last night. So you may guess where this story is going. All we had was some powdered, a flavored fruit drink that we could mix with water and saltine crackers. Again, Sarah, reflecting you. And so we had what I think was a very meaningful communion service with a kind of Kool-Aid and saltine crackers. So that and the other thought was, at least my memory is, that scholars believe that in the early days, communion was probably home communion. I doubt that they were having it in the synagogues. There was still tension between the Jewish followers of Christ and those who did not see Christ as the Messiah. So that likely the whole business of communion was any meal was sacramental. And I believe that every meal is sacramental. So I think it's tragic that one of the things that has divided major arms of Christendom is the Lord's Supper. Our understanding. And the Lutherans and Presbyterians reached an agreement at one point back, I think, in the late 90s. And I will read just a few sentences from an article about that. It ends by saying that both Lutheran and Reformed churches affirm that Christ himself is host at the table. Both churches affirm that Christ himself is truly present and received in the supper. Here's the key sentence. Neither communion professes to explain how this is so. Would that spirit of humility would prevail. And we today in this podcast do not profess to know how it happened. I'll end with that, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Don, what about you?
You used the word unfolding, so I'll go with that. Thank you. The living bread is not bread. Not like eating bread. It's something different. It's something entirely different. I'm reading this year, realizing that. And that this entire experience that we're talking about is literature. It's written down. And so this encounter that we have with bread and communion, the blood and the body is through the symbolic language in this gospel, this fantastic piece of literature. It's shocking and wild and stunning, and it's held up as just a great book on its own. And I just wanted to go in there and say unfolding also is what is unfolding before us in the symbolic language that Jesus is using, that the author of John is using, that it is a book that we are unfolding with the system, with the stages that have been put into this. And forgive me if you don't agree with this, but I'm going to provide an analogy for the shocking metaphor, or a metaphor for a metaphor. Because I was thinking, what if somebody today came to me and said, look, come on. I mean, now we're getting way out there. It's just so shocking. How do you really explain this? And I'd say, well, first of all, I'm going to explain it with an analogy of literature. Most folks listen to this on podcast audio, but if you're one of the few people that watch this on Zoom, one of the interesting features of the four squares which we speak to us from different parts of the country is there are a lot of books in the picture. Mm-hmm. It's almost like wallpaper. I mean, there's a lot of books in our offices and our living rooms, and there's just a bunch of them. And I'm sure a lot more that are not even in the picture. And I want to use that as the analogy that if, let's say, a librarian came to you and says, I'm going to prepare a place for you in your house. I'm going to curate 10,000 books for you. Now, this especially will speak to the hearts of those readers out there. You go, wow, heaven, 10,000 books for me. Or you'd say, look, I'm going to spend a wild sum of money and I'm going to fill a wall with shelves and books. And you won't even be able to see the drywall anymore because there are going to be so many books. What is that? And I think, for me, looking at this as a book of John and literature, that's an analogy that helps me too. Because I don't know about you, but I forget that I have books. I forget that there are books to read. Whether a librarian gives me 10,000 books or I buy 10,000 books, I can forget that they're there and that they're pretty and that they're wallpaper. It's kind of a storing up of literature that's never encountered. There they are on the wall. And I don't know about you, but when I read with delight, I say I eat it. I consume the literature. But if they're sitting on the wall, and in my frame, I've got a few books on the wall back behind me, I can't even tell you all the books that are over there, and I actually haven't read them all. I want to. I have a memory of how delicious it can be. And the bunny trails it creates as I want to search more and more things. It is a delight. I think readers out there would say, I'm changed. Every time I read a paragraph or a book, I am changed. I think that's connected to the kind of literature that we have in the letters and the scriptures too, that we can be changed by that. Is it stored up on the wall, or do you remember what it was like to consume great literature? Do you remember chapter 6 of John? I didn't. Not like we did this week. Thank you, Sarah, for the question. Is it wallpaper, or is it something in which you engage on a very personal level? Is it a library, or is it a menu on which you feast? Do you remember what it was like to feast? I haven't read a full book in a long time. I want to. I'm starting to forget what it was like to have that time. Do you own the books or do you devour the books? Is it just paper or is it a human engagement? I see in the Zoom that we're looking on lots of book spines. Is it spines or minds? Is it static or does it create a desire for more? And that whole engagement, you reflect on what it is to be a reader, and that whole engagement, I cannot begin to explain, right? Because we could stay all day about our life, our change, the turning of the page, the unfolding that's taking place on that journey. Very personal, but also something we share with each other. We can see the lives, the philosophies, and the science of other people. That's the analogy that's working for me today, as I think, I haven't ever read that book. Do I have the time? Or another. Do I remember what it was like to feast on literature? And this is literature, too, that we're working with today. And it is exciting. And it lets me, if I go back and remember chapter 6, it lets me remember that it's actually not bread at all. It's something much more complicated, something much more whole. Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome. You made me think of The Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is one of the books I read early in my developmental years, and how that became a doorway into understanding language and words, and how much that just was I would say a waterway I wanted to visit more and more and more and drink more of. So thank you for that. Bill, do you want to talk about how communion has changed? I think we already did that for you. Charles, what do you think?
I better keep it alone for right now.
So one of the pieces I feel like I need to add as a person who makes bread occasionally is that Jesus is a starter that we can add to ordinary ingredients to start a loaf of bread. And maybe that's what we're asked to do as Christ followers, is to use that starter and make bread to feed other people. That's the end of my story.
Well, and we're out of time. So thank you, folks, for listening in. We always appreciate you being there and the comments that you give us about these podcasts. Palma Cía Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And at that site, you will find other discussions about these lectionary passages, other opinions, other insights. We commend that to you. You can also hear great sermons, outstanding music, meditations, and prayers at that site. So check it out. You're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.